white privilege, and other timely subjects. It is my great pleasure to welcome Gregg Kimball and Christina Gabby.
Thank you, Sophia, and thanks to the Pratt Library for having us. So, Gregg, you start the book with this recording session where James Lee Strother songs were captured. Can you kind of bring us into that moment? Because I think that's a good place for us to start too. Who was he? Why was he being recorded? And again, maybe a little bit about who was making the recording for those who might not be familiar with Alan Lomax.
Yes, I think it is the right moment, definitely, to start our conversation. I'm going to step back one day to June 13th, the day before the recordings were made. John Lomax, who was a Texan professor at one point, had written a really fine book on cowboy songs, in fact. But in an age really when there was no such thing really as a folklorist, it was an avocation more than a thing. He convinces the Library of Congress to start to record what he calls folk music. And of course, when someone of my generation who thinks of folk music, they probably think of Peter, Paul, and Mary. Well, that's not what John Lomax was about, of course. He was looking to record what he thought was authentic traditional music, particularly of African Americans. Why did he go to prisons? He went to prisons because he thought those were places where these early sounds would be preserved by people who had been incarcerated for a long period of time. So they wouldn't have been influenced by records and those things that ruin folk music, as he would have seen it. And so he and a fellow named Harold Spivak, who had just within a couple of years become the head of the music division at Library of Congress, got in their car and drove from Washington down to Goochland County in Virginia, where the Virginia State Prison Farm is located. It just shut down a few years ago, in fact, although most of the buildings are still there. And again, they're seeking this authentic music. They arrive, and as Spivak says, the warden had a Hollywood-style greeting for them. He already had an African-American quartet that burst into song as soon as they drove up. They weren't really that interested in the quartet, but they saw a gentleman with a battered banjo sitting on the steps of the warden's house. It's just still there, and approached him. Lomax spoke with him for supposedly a couple hours, and they didn't make recordings that day. They went back to Washington, but as soon as they got back on the 14th, they immediately started to record Jimmy Strother. So Strother records 13 songs. There are 2 takes of several, so there are actually 15 recordings. So this is kind of unprecedented. Really, that was pretty rare for him to make that many recordings of any single artist. So he obviously had a high opinion of him. What did he record? He recorded blues, he recorded spirituals, he recorded a couple labor songs. He recorded a song we would kind of categorize today as old-time music, a song that's traditionally called Cripple Creek. And so that then asks us the question, well, why, this guy's got a broad repertoire. He's not stuck in any particular genre. Well, he's a street singer. And if you're a street singer, you've got to be versatile. Now, one of my theories is that Jim Strother probably could have played a pop song, but that Lomax had a certain influence in him, just like anybody in the street would have. Maybe they asked for a particular kind of music. Well, of course he would provide that. But what he did record is remarkable in its scope. And so it always had intrigued me, the music that he had made.
Yeah, and we'll listen to a clip of Do Lord Remember Me from that recording session.
Yeah, let's listen to this just to give you a sense of what. Now, he's here paired with another inmate named Joe Lynn Lee, he's singing the high part. It's kind of a rhythmic effect I want you to pay attention to.
Lord, remember me. remember me. Lord, Lord, remember me. Lord, remember me. Down on my knees when I was in trouble. Lord, remember me. When I was in trouble. Lord, remember me. 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 Lord, remember me.
Yeah, it's fantastic, and all of the tracks are fantastic that you recorded that
they
day.
really are, and you can hear almost all of his music if you have Spotify or go to YouTube.
Yeah,
I mean, it's all, there is one song that did not get put. I did not found it yet. There's a second take of a kind of salacious song that he sings that hasn't seemed to have made it to the digital era yet. But and by the way, this image on the front of the book was taken during the recording of this song, and so you see Joe Lee is on the left, and that's Jimmy on the left here. I'm almost
on the right.
Oh, I'm sorry. I probably got it backwards because I'm showing it to backwards. And as I said, Strother's voice is that baritone voice. One of the things you might have heard, that percussive effect. Joe Lee was actually doing what they call fiddlesticks on the bass strings of his guitar. Did you hear that kind of percussive, almost drumming sound? This was a technique that people used on fiddles, where one person would hit the bass strings of the fiddle while the other person bowed the fiddle. And it creates this really dynamic, rhythmic effect. So this is kind of a very cool image in that you know exactly the song they're performing.
So Strother is one musician who happens to be, recorded because he is in prison, and we can talk about why that is as well. But he's in prison, and it's the day that John Lomax, who happens to have this recording equipment, comes down there. But what's really interesting about him being captured in this way, and the story that you've told in the book, even more so because Lomax did not give us all of the information, is that it really tells us a bigger story about Black American music, and specifically music that sometimes doesn't get talked about as much as blues and jazz and these forms.
Yes, and your setup for that is so entirely correct. This book would not exist if these recordings didn't exist, because there are thousands of Jimmy Strothers who are playing on the streets and playing in medicine shows and all across the landscape of America. But he happened to be, I won't say the right place, but in a place to be recorded. In terms of sort of how he fits into that world, it's important to understand he's born in 1881. So he's a generation earlier than almost all of the blues people who we might hear on commercial recordings or even field recordings. He's in an era where there is no recording. And what I see in his music is he is, as we see with this song, which is first written down in 1867 in a book called Slave Songs of the United States, which is one of the first compilations of Black sacred music.
The very first.
Yes, the very first. Yes. So he's drawing on that part of his tradition. He grows up in rural Culpeper County in the northern Piedmont of Virginia. So he's absorbing all that, but he's also in a world where all kinds of other music is starting to happen. You had the beginnings of ragtime. You had people saying play party songs when they were children. And you even see verses from these play party songs showing up in Jim Strother's music. You have, we talk about the spirituals, but there was a whole variety of sacred music. There were what they called the Dr. Watts hymns. And all of these were we almost can't categorize them because I don't know, somebody needs to write a book about that. Seriously. Could be, you know, and then you had field hollers and things that people sang while they were in the fields and all kinds of other things that were just there in the soundscape. And so all of that flows into his music, and that's one of the things I try to unpack in the chapter is not only unpack his life, but also unpack um, where the sources for his music. In some cases, there is no known source for some of the songs that he performs, which may really only point to the fact that the documentation of this era is not great.
And I think it's, I mean, and it probably just plainly say that it's not right, because you wish that there had been, yeah, hundreds of folklorists out there actually recording people and paying attention to them and not thinking, oh, this is just a busker on the street, but rather somebody who is a talented musician that we could record and kind of preserve something that's going to be lost over a certain amount of time, no matter what.
Exactly, and again, we have to come back to what Lomax wanted. So one of the things we know he actually asked for from other artists was complaining songs. Well, Strother delivered one called I used to work for a tractor. Mike Hardy was his name. It's about this boss, this hateful boss that he had. So I think Lomax wasn't clueless. Like he at least asked for a broad dimension of things, but again, there's things that he wouldn't have. I think also the other funny story is that so the second day when they come down, Lomax tells Spivak, go ahead and record Jimmy Strother. I'm going to go around the yard and find some other people to record. He just completely leaves Spivak alone with Strother. So I think like when he does Tennessee Dog, for instance, I'm not sure that's what Lomax really would have wanted, but it's a great song. Where are we on the song list, by the way?
We were gonna play a clip of "Thought I Heard My Banjo Say."
Let's do that because again, that gets to the idea of a kind of well, actually, it's very timely for us right now. But let's hear the song first. This is typically called Cripple Creek, but he called it "Thought I Heard My Banjo Say."
Oh, yeah, my banjo sound. Oh, yeah, my banjo sound. Going to Cripple Creek, going down. Leave Cripple Creek, going to roll. Leave Cripple Creek. Gather up Cripple Creek, shooting off head. Don't eat nothing but fish and bread. Don't eat. Banjo sound. Oh, yeah, my banjo. Oh, yeah, my banjo sound. Going to Cripple Creek, going down. Leave Cripple Creek, going to roll. Going to Cripple Creek, man, I feel roll my britches up to my knees. I'm going to Cripple Creek, man,
What do you think of that? These are not terrible recordings. They're actually much better than some of the other. You know, these are lacquered metal discs that are being recorded on, and some of them are in frightful shape. But these are not bad actually. So let's think about the recent controversy with Beyonce and Cowboy Carter, like black people playing country music. That's not unprecedented, right? What is that? That's part of the origins of early country music. We know the banjo is developed out of with over a long period of transformation from African instruments. So this isn't one of the very few recordings of a black banjo player. He played almost all of his tunes on banjo during the session. He played 3 on guitar, which I'm sure for him was an adaptation to a new sound, the blues, right? So when new stuff comes out, he's got to change with the times.
One of the things that I found most compelling as a Baltimore dweller was Strother's time here in the city as a musician. Can you tell us more about that and the kind of musical scene that he was a part of?
Yeah, and Baltimore is really important. He lived in Baltimore at least 25 years. And so the question arises, how did he get here? We find him in the 1910 census living in the 17th Ward in here. But interestingly enough, we find him in 1900, a James L. Strother, living in a shanty on the property of the Sparrows Point steel mill, which some of you may know is one of the largest steel mills in the world here in Baltimore County. So at first I was like, is this really my James L. Strother, right? As a researcher, you got to say, okay, is this really what's going on? Then I find his marriage certificate, his marriage register to his second wife. He's living on Oak Street in Baltimore. Then, and this was, thank God for digitized newspapers. I'm searching the Baltimore Sun, thinking there's no way anybody's going to be paying any attention, right, to one of hundreds of African-American street singers. 1915, these incredible articles about him is something maybe we'll cover later, really revolving around whether he's allowed to play on the streets. But one thing it nailed down was it says, yes, he was blinded in an industrial accident at the Sparrows Point steel mill sometime between 1900 and 1910. So what does he do? He does what a lot of blind people do in this period. He becomes a musician. Obviously had some skills before. I think that's pretty clear. But so I see, again, I have to build the story out of these kind of snatches of things. Now, what was the scene? Again, I think it was just as diverse as what he was doing. There's accounts in the Baltimore African American of minstrel kinds of shows being done right on the streets of Baltimore. Of course, you have a larger musical thing going on Pennsylvania Avenue, where you have the big bands and some great musicians, of course, that come out of Baltimore. But in saloons and smaller venues, you had guitar players. There was something too that he actually called his music string music. And that's kind of an interesting thing. He didn't categorize it by genre. He told the governor of Virginia when he was trying to get out of prison, and he's writing letters to him. And he says, I'm proficient at the playing of string music. That's how he thought of his music. And again, you would have seen performers all over the place like that. I think of Baltimore, there's a great 1930 article that I found about Baltimore's sort of street life. And it talks about, foreign-born people playing accordions and you have and I apologize, what's the correct pronunciation? Is it Arabber? Or, yeah. You have those folks who are also having their calls going down the street as they try to get people to buy their wares. So you have this really, really, I think, rich soundscape. You have black brass bands, very famous ones. So it's this really wonderful pastiche of things. Yes, you have a lot of Southerners too. You have a lot of Virginians who have moved into Baltimore to get, at least partially away from, they're not getting away from segregation, but at least they can find maybe some better jobs. So you have a lot of Jimmy's family also were migrating, and you see them in Pennsylvania and all these other, there's a whole story about his family members.
And you've gotten into this a little bit, but the City of Hartman's words, the life of the dispossessed is so hard to follow in the historic record because they're not the people who are allowed to make the historic record, right? And so following the life of somebody like James Lee Strother is going to be incredibly hard. And you've talked a little bit about census records and newspaper records. And I know you've been working on this for a very long time, but so how did you kind of try to compile and I almost think of it as triangulation, right? Where you have these 3 points and okay, I can say, or I don't do math, but I have these certain points of this triangle and I can figure out the third point because of the math that I can.
Yeah, and I think what you end up with, which is a good thing, I think, is this isn't really a biography. It's really about the life and times of a person who's really, now there's a lot of personal stuff in there too, but he's also emblematic of all of these other musicians who I found great stuff in the newspapers about street musicians being kicked off the streets, how the justice system treated them, all of the things that he would have experienced day to day. The key things that I had, and this would never have been a book if I hadn't found these. One is his pardon file. So he's in prison. I think he's a little over 4 years in. He's writing to the governor. He has a very devoted nephew in Baltimore, Walter Taylor. Walter Taylor, who is writing to the governor, trying to get him and saying basically, if you let him out, I'll take care of him. Because by this time he's not in great shape. So yeah, that was key. So I actually have letters that he didn't write. He was unfortunately illiterate, but that people wrote for him. He tells about the murder that he committed, the circumstances. He tells who his family members are. So you get all kinds of information from those. Then we have the actual penitentiary records, which also document his time incarcerated. The newspaper stuff is really good. There's a lot of newspaper articles related to the murder that he committed, and then a smattering of others related to him that I found in the Baltimore papers. So it is I think triangulation is an excellent way to put it. You're trying to intersect all these things, little things. Lomax and later some other folklorists at the Library of Congress wrote down what they had, what they learned from Jimmy Strother about his life. For instance, that he had been in medicine shows, which I don't know if you are familiar with these, but they're a really interesting phenomena in American history, although they go back into medieval times at least that far, the Montebanks, as they were called. And basically it is selling cure-alls. So salves and all kinds of things. Baltimore had over 100 drug companies that were making these kinds of things around 1900. And so he went on the road with them. And so they would typically a small show would have, you'd have a wagon, you'd have maybe a comedian, some musicians, because the musician's job really was to draw the crowd, right? You've got to create something that's going to generate people to come for the pitch. And in the book, you'll see there's a wonderful a series of images that the artist Ben Shahn did of a really late period medicine show on a street in Tennessee. So we know he did this, that this was part of his music. And again, I found in the Afro-American this incredible ad that says essentially, I'm trying to remember the exact terms, that banjo player needed, and gives must be able to sing loud, so these requirements that they had for a medicine show performer. This might be a good time to play Tennessee Dog. Yeah. So this is a song that Mike Seeger used to perform quite a bit, and really when you hear it, it fits. This is where this would be perfect for these medicine shows.
What do you want to buy, little dog? I'm right here to tell you. Ain't no catfish, ain't no hog, and I'm right here to tell you that dog, that Tennessee dog. Oh, his head is long, ears is flat, and they'll stop eating till the ball up that dog. Talking about that dog. He the meanest dog has come from Tennessee. Now he eat more meat than any butcher dog can take pork chops and a liver. He catch more rats than any other cat on the side of Mississippi River. That dog, talking about that dog.
I love this song. His ears are flat. He never stops eating until he balls that jack, which is a dance, balling the jack, and also a railroading term, interestingly. So this is the kind of music, you spirited, something you deliver to get people to gather around for the medicine show.
And so Alan Lomax recorded Strother.
John.
Yes, John. Did I
Yeah,
say
yeah.
Alan? Sorry.
Well, that's okay. They're easy to confuse.
They are easy to
The father
confuse. They're
and
father
son.
and son.
Yeah.
And without these recordings, we would. I mean, would anybody even ever know, who James Lee Strother was, right? Like he's created this record. But today, there's in some circles, there's a little bit of a controversy about John's approach as this white educated man who is going to incarcerated Black folks and asking them to sing. And perhaps as a performer, James Lee Strother thought, this is great. I can't wait. I'm going to, get recorded. But at the same time, doesn't really have a choice, right? You're incarcerated. You're going to do what the warden tells you to do. And Lomax doesn't really care about, getting every part of Jimmy Strother, calling him Blind Jimmy Strother instead of James Lee Strother, and getting this information right. And of course, if he did, we may not need this book now, right? Because it would be all in the Library of Congress record.
He made a lot of mistakes.
Yeah.
He said he was blinded in a accident in a mine.
Right. And then that
wrong.
kind of captures the imagination though of, oh, if it's in a mine, it's a coal mine, oh, he's Appalachian, and we get all of these other distortions that happen. But can you tell us a little bit, you spoke about it a little bit at the beginning, but just Lomax's approach, and maybe how we're kind of dealing with that legacy today of, yes, there's this benefit because we have the recordings, but also we have to contend with who he was as a collector.
It was absolutely true. I mean, you have to understand the context. You have to understand that Lomax wanted certain things. He did not think of these artists really as, except for Leadbelly, who he very famously exploited, and took him to New York and did all this, dressed him in overalls, and did kind of really tried to cultivate a persona. And I think he thought of the artists more as personas than actual people in some ways. And he was very coercive. There was a situation in another penitentiary where there was a man who someone said, "Oh, this man knows some great levee songs, working on the levee." And the man had gotten religion, and he said, "I can't sing that." Well, what does Lomax do? He goes and gets the warden to come and insist that this guy, and in the recording, this poor guy, I think his name was Samson, says a prayer like, "Forgive me for singing this song," basically. So yeah, he was large and in charge, put it that way. He put out a couple compilations, including some of Jimmy Strother's material, and he's kind of the interlocutor. He introduces the songs, he frames them. He's interpreting what Jimmy Strother means. And this is a great segue, actually. So some things I don't think Lomax caught. So, we played Thought I Heard My Banjo Say, sprightly banjo playing. The final verses of that song are, "Read and run, drinking whiskey, drinking beer, don't let sundown catch you here." That was not a message for Lomax, okay? And he has like I said, he has this labor song where it talks about this oppressive labor that he's under. There's a darkness to some of his, particularly some of his spirituals. This is a dangerous world, and to be a blind person, isolated on the streets, and a Black person, you were subjected to all kinds of, I'm sure, indignities. And we know of cases with other musicians who, Gary Davis down in Durham, North Carolina, actually stabbed somebody who tried to take some money out of his hand that a woman had given him. He had to defend himself. These guys, people kind of think of it as a joke, but many of the blind musicians carry weapons to defend themselves. So, yeah, this is a very, very tough life.
Yeah, and I know that you talked to both Corey Harris and Dom Flemons. Did either of them give you kind of any feelings about, how they engage with this historic material?
It's a great point. So Dom is a young man who's kind of taken on. He was a member of a group called the Carolina Chocolate Drops. Young black people who are reinterpreting a lot of this early music, and so I really wanted his opinion to think about what does this person mean to him. He's a big fan of Jimmy Strother's. He actually covered one of his songs on his recent project. And so I was very interested in thinking about what was his view of where Strother was coming from. And I think he very much responded to these kind of messages in the songs that a white person is just not going to get. And it's even in some songs that are kind of almost minstrel songs, but there are certain lyrics in them. There's an old expression, a really great, wonderful book called "Singing the Master," and it's mostly about. And Jimmy Strother does a song called "Corn Shucking Time." If you just listen to it, you think, oh, this is just kind of minstrelly stuff. But the corn shucking was actually a really important moment for enslaved people. First of all, it kicked off the end of the season of field work. It also, the enslavers would have people from surrounding plantations come in to shuck the corn. So people who their wife might have lived on the next, farm over. So it brought large numbers of black people together. There was a master who would drive the shucking musically, and then at the end of the night they would have what I love this term, the frolic, where they would dance and play music. And one of the things that musicians would do is poke fun at the masters. Like, did he provide good food? Is he, there were only these small moments where they were able to do this. But one of the ways that they were able to do it was through music. And so, you got to think, you just have to think hard about it. And I think that's what Corey and Dom understood way more than I did, of course, I had to really pay attention to that when I was looking at the lyrics in the music.
Going to Richmond? Should we play that?
Yes, and I'll do a little intro here. So this is a little different. So as I said earlier, you've always got to change with the times. Remember, he's recorded in 1936. We've already had at least almost 2 decades of recording of blues and other more modern forms of music. And so this is what we traditionally call like an 8-bar blues. So it's 8, what you call it? Measures. Boy, that ran around my head. And it's very typical of a Piedmont style of blues. And this is where it connects to people like John Cephas and John Jackson, people that I knew as I was coming up playing this music.
Yes, your fair Brown will tell you, yes, she love you all her life. Me another dude round the corner and really tell that same life way. Alexander women, I sure gonna do this fight. Got a handful of gimme and a mouthful of much oblige.
That line, I love that line. Got a handful of gimme and a mouthful of much obliged. Very classic line in blues. This song, though, is actually about his second wife who he murdered, Blanche Green. And one of the things I do in the book is really look at her family as well. And she's also from Culpeper County. It's still kind of unclear exactly how they ended up marrying. I don't even know what happened to Mary, his first wife. And I mentioned earlier this controversy about him playing on the street. The reason that became an issue and got into the newspapers is because Mary was the cook for the collector of the Port of Baltimore, a guy named William Stone, who was a very powerful politician in the city. And he writes a scathing letter to the mayor and to the head of the charities in Baltimore about him being prevented from playing on the street. And that's a whole nother story. But
That's in the book.
it is in the it's in the book. But in this case, this is the saddest part of the whole book. So they're about 20 years difference in age. We know they had common, Culpeper's not that big a place. She's working as a domestic in Alexandria. He said, Alexandria women I sure do despise. He's still living in Baltimore when they marry in 1923 in Alexandria, but they move back. By 1930, he's listed as a musician playing in a music hall in the town of Culpeper. And I do want to also say Zan Nelson, who's a local historian in Culpeper, you cannot replicate the kind of knowledge she had of that community. And she introduced me to people that really made the story real and helped me understand things that I would never have understood. She found and contacted Blanche's grandson and his wife, and they came to Culpeper, and really Jim Green was his name. He really had no idea about any of this. His father had not, it was a family secret. And Jim, he said it really helped him understand his father, knowing some of this, which is, I can't even explain what experience it was. But that's the kind of, that's the right word, how much I appreciate people speaking to me, because, you're digging into other people's, my own family, I know this very much to be true, dirty laundry that people don't want to talk about. So the story is basically this. They had a very tumultuous relationship, clearly. They had two kids from children that Blanche brought to the marriage, a boy and a girl. Jim's father was one of them. He was 15 years old. And one night, he came home. He accused her of being out with a man who was the father of one of his children, and he ends up shooting her. And unfortunately, she lingers for a number of days at the University Hospital, now UVA, in Charlottesville, and she dies. And he goes before a grand jury. Of course, it's no surprise. He's indicted, and he decides to plead guilty to second-degree murder. And that's how he ends up at the state prison farm.
And these recordings, again, having them provides such riches. And we talked a little bit about Dom and Corey. But once you make a record, once it's at a place like the Library of Congress, kind of is able to take on a life of its own that ends up in some ways also being separated from this hard history, because it's just a recording of a song in an archive and not necessarily the embodied full story of this musician, for better and worse. Can you tell us just briefly a little bit about the kind of legacy that these recordings had after Strother's passing?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because his recordings are actually put out in the early 40s, some of the songs. This again gives you a sense of that. Lomax and the Library of Congress thought pretty highly of his music. They issued them on these the old Victrola records. This is before LPs and 45s, and they were sold in sets, and they were thematic ones. And so one was basically Negro, quote unquote, Negro sacred songs, basically religious songs. And so Strother is still alive. I didn't tell you this, but he's out of jail now. He did get out of prison, and he's living in Baltimore. Again, he returns he's living with this nephew of his. And so in his lifetime, these recordings are actually now out in the public domain. Now, some of these records probably didn't sell a whole lot. They were pretty specialized, but very quickly they become in circulation. The Golden Gate Quartet, one of the greatest of the great Tidewater Virginia quartets, I should say nationally. I mean, they end up moving to New York. They're one of the greatest of the sacred quartets. Record one of his songs. And it kind of snowballs from there. And to kind of tell this a specific story about this, I'm going to have play you a couple more recordings. So I'm going to play you probably his most iconic song, which is called "The Bloodstained Banners." And then we're going to play a cover of that song, and you get to guess who the artist is.
If you want to go to heaven, over on the other shore, keep all the way out of blood-drained banners, a good shepherd feed my sheep. Some for poor, some for silent, some for to make my heart rejoice. Don't you hear lambs are crying, a good shepherd feed my sheep. If you want to go to heaven, just over on the other shore, keep out away the gunshot devils, the good shepherd feed my sheep. Some for poor, some for silence, some for to make my heart rejoice. Don't you hear lambs are crying, the good shepherd feed my sheep. If you want to go to heaven.
If you want to get to heaven, over on the other shore, stay out of the way of the bloodstained bandit. Oh, good shepherd, feed my sheep. One for poor, one for silent, one for to make my heart rejoice. Can't you hear my lambs calling? Oh, good shepherd, feed my sheep.
Any guesses?
You know?
No?
Oh, well, that's not fair.
That's not fair. You got, yeah. You are very close. It's actually Yorma who's singing this. This is Jefferson Airplane, 1969, from their album Volunteers. So this gets us to this question of how songs circulate and how some become really iconic and live on. We already mentioned that Lomax put these out very quickly. This song is already out on 78. Later, it's issued on a Library of Congress LP in like 58, I believe, 1958. And so, luckily, Jorma Kekkonen, who's the singer, and of course now is part of the band Hot Tuna, still performing. In his biography and on his website, he talks about how he learned the song. He got it from these two folk singers. Most of these rockers, particularly in the Bay Area, they were early on into, they were exploring early folk music. That's the Grateful Dead, people like that, and they were part of that scene. And there were these two guys. Larry Hanks is the one that I contacted, who's still around. And Jorma says, I went to see these guys play this song, and we were like blown away. This is like a fantastic song, and so I had to learn it. So where did they learn it? So, being the kind of person I am, I found Larry Hanks. Unfortunately, his partner had passed away, but I asked him, I said, where did you get this song? Like, what was the source? And he said, it had to have been from an album. He said, and it probably was this 58 Library of Congress album. And one of the points I make in the book is, my kids, they had access to almost every blues song ever recorded digitally. We have this incredible, it blows my mind that what we actually watch on YouTube when there's this incredible, I would have died for that when I was coming up in the late 60s, early 70s. We were out buying 78s and the very few LP reissues of some of this music that even existed. So here's all of a sudden you go from Jim Strother to Jefferson Airplane, and there were people like the Seegers, Mike Seeger, Pete Seeger. Pete took that song and made it into a protest song. So these things get circulated. The kicker with all of that. So I was trying to figure, are there any early precedents for this song? Before Jim Strother records it in 1936. And I was looking through a really important book by Marshall Taylor, who was a minister. He's originally from Kentucky. Like a lot of Black Kentuckians, he moved to Cincinnati. He created one of the earliest compilations of Black folk song in the early 1880s. And I knew that it had one song that was kind of related, so I was looking through the book. And all of a sudden, I see exactly Jim Strother's chorus in a song I had no idea. The other thing that Reverend Taylor did is he recorded who he got the song from, and her name was America Bell. There's 2 America Bells in the census that fit. This is the crazy rabbit holes you go down. And they're both were born in the antebellum period, enslaved, and both of them, were Black Kentuckians who moved into Ohio. So this is him writing this down in 1881. He's recording something that somebody learned before the Civil War, and I have no idea how. The big lesson here is, and we said it earlier. We've created a canon of, for instance, the spirituals. Go Down Moses, all the classic ones. There's 100 other, probably 1,000 other songs we'll never know about. And that's just the nature of oral culture, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have time for a few questions from the audience if there's anybody who has a burning question for Greg. Oh yeah,
Okay.
let's start with that one. So for people online, we talked a little bit about research process, but also just how long this came together, because it was a lot.
It was a long time. I take a long time to write books. Part of that is I was a working archivist and historian at the Library of Virginia for almost 30 years. And before that, I was a curator at a museum, in the City Museum in Richmond. So I didn't have a lot of time to do my own writing, although I've done quite, a fair amount. And I'm a big believer. For me, it was a little chaotic because I only got to do it periodically. And like I said earlier, I had these breakthroughs where I found these like groups of records that revealed all kinds of things I didn't think I'd ever find out. I thought this is going to be an article somewhere, in the end. And it just kept building and snowballing. And so, yeah, it took me a long time to do it. The good news is I am an archivist, so I do know about records. I actually interned at the Maryland Hall of Records, which is now the State Archives. I won't tell you when. So I did know, in that sense, I knew how to mine things. But the thing is, you pull one thread and a bunch of other things happen. So for instance, I find this document in his pardon file that lists his relatives who will vouch for him basically when he's released. Who are these people? Now I have to go and figure out who they are. Let me say this too, that I want to really give some credit to Zan. One person on there, she was listed as living in Forest, Virginia. There's a Forest, Virginia. It's out, I think, near Lynchburg somewhere. No, there's a local community called The Forest in Culpeper County. And Zan saw it and she immediately knew who the person was. So this kind of work, particularly in someone as obscure as this guy, it's not for the faint-hearted. We don't have thousands and thousands of records to work from. Yes, ma'am? Okay. Okay, 78 is a shorthand. I apologize. It stands for 70 RPM. It's the speed that the disc spins. It's like 33s or 45s. They spin at 45 revolutions per minute. And then they're 10 inches. There's a song on each side, usually. So these are the records that you would find basically from about the turn of the century up to the 50s, like Elvis recorded on 78s. And that, you know, the old Victrolas that you wind up, those are the kind of records that you would have on that. Okay, help me with the second question. Absolutely, I would love to come because, you know, Lexington Market is mentioned in some of these articles because it was a central place for people who are, sometimes these people are called buskers. You know, that's an English term. But they were, the article I mentioned from 1930 talks about that, you know, you go where the people are when you are a street musician. So absolutely, there would have been street musicians performing in that area. There's parts of it that are, like we can talk about, for instance, the first song I played, it's a spiritual, and that certainly is a term that we would apply to that. Going to Richmond is a blues, definitely a blues. Some of the other ones are a little harder to categorize.
I don't think I had to talking about. Some people might call them, you know, early country or old time country music or things like that. But what happened? Yeah, songster. But what really happened is that with the advent of this recorded music and the record industry, they said, okay, if you're black and you're playing this music, it's called blues or it's called jug band, and if you're white, it's called country. And that was the like line that the
Yeah.
industry made. And so you could play something like a song like Cripple Creek, or I Heard My Banjo Say, and you know, just based on who the musician was, that record industry would decide what genre of music it is. And so that one of the things that, you know, musicians like Don Flemons and others are trying to do now is to kind of bring it back all together and say, we don't need that delineation. We can be kind of in this musical community together, and we can have black string band music that goes from blues to country, you know, and back and everywhere in between.
A great example of this is there was a group called the Tennessee Chocolate Drops, which is where the North Carolina group got their name. And they recorded in 1930 in Knoxville, Tennessee. They didn't know what the heck to do with it. So they put it out on the so-called race series, which was just simply meant that's music for black people. And they called them the Tennessee Chocolate Drops. Then they put it out on the White Hillbilly series, and they called them the Tennessee Trio. So they, even the studio was like, what do I do with this? You know, what kind of music is this? This was common, like, but that's why there's so few recordings of, say, black string bands, because of the industry said, black people, you play jazz, you play blues, blah, blah, blah.
We have time for about one more question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was surprised looking at the medicine show. There's a couple books I can't say they're great. I think that's a book for somebody to write. I mean, now the trajectory is a little bit like this. Actually, in the 19th century, there were these enormous medicine shows, and they often played off Native American themes. So there was the Kickapoo Indian medicine show. I mean, you know, because there was this mystique about herbs, herbal remedies, indigenous people. So some of those reviews were like casts of 50 people, but later it kind of fell out of favor, and it became much smaller, more informal, less organized. I think from the newspaper coverage, there was a bunch of these people in Baltimore that were based in Baltimore. U.B. Blake, famous musician from Baltimore, mentions as a youth going off and going with one of these medicine shows, and then of course the guy didn't pay him, which so he got out of there pretty fast. But I think these things were all over the place. Yeah, it's again, there's a lot of other really. One other thing, I don't want to go over our time. One other thing I would say too about future research, and this gets back to the most early stuff that probably you know more about than I do, but I'm working right now for an organization that's particularly looking at the influence of the domestic slave trade in America. You know, we took 850,000 Black people and forcibly moved them to the Deep South, right? And Richmond was the biggest market in the Upper South, which is why we are doing this. What does that say musically? When these early songsters and people in Virginia end up in Louisiana and Mississippi, and that's something, and may not even be able to be written about because it may not be enough documentation. But it's really interesting. We do not think of this, how enormous, this was the largest mass movement. You know, we talk, rightly so, talk about the movement, say the Trail of Tears, right? Trail of Tears, at least in terms of numbers, has nothing on this. This is massive. At any rate,
Really
I will stop
interesting.
pontificating. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Please thank our moderator, Christina Gaddy. And tonight's author, Gregg Kimball. And so now we're going to sign some books. Again, if you haven't already, now I don't know what you're waiting for. Books are for sale outside by Ivy Bookshop, and we'll see you to sign right now. Thanks for coming tonight.